This is Van Zwaadhaak. I'm the collections manager at the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art. And today I'm going to talk about salvage and recovery. First discussing museum standard practices, and then just using some case studies from the Ringling Museum to exemplify things that we didn't think about that are in the standard museum practices, and that might be useful because I think one of the main points to make is that there's lots of information out there to help you in recovery, lots of resources, but knowing your own collection is one of the key points in writing one of the recovery plans for emergency manual. And for me personally, it's usually the most difficult one, since there's no real drills to exercise a lot of this information. So sometimes the practical experience is the best you can get, and that's usually the one that you actually don't want to go through. So it's great to look at this at both practical and museum practices. The first slide's kind of going through the general steps you can take, hopefully a little bit before a disaster strikes, and also in the process of the disaster itself, and then in the salvage time period. Disaster alert. It is wonderful if you have lead time like in a hurricane and you have, say, 48 hours to prepare. Take all your key information with you. Be prepared to have all your contact information for vendors, for insurance companies. But a lot of disasters, unfortunately, this is not the case. And you go immediately into a second step of safety first. Assessing your buildings, your collections areas, see what has happened, look for water shutoffs, for example, electricity, gas in your building. Usually if you have followed an incident command structure, there is the incident commander that will tell you when a building is safe and when you can start your first assessment. It's wonderful, as we discussed before, if you have an off-site environment where you actually can regroup, have a group together where you can start discussing your damage and start prioritizing and start assessing tasks to people. If this is on your site, it's wonderful, and otherwise off-site is a great environment to go to. Getting your prep materials there is another important key. So later in the PowerPoint we talk about supplies. Having those in the environment where it's stable is a key thing. Stabilize the building and the environment before you go in. See if you can get air conditioning, temperature and humidity back up to 70 degrees, 45 to 50% humidity is very important for the salvage procedures. And documentation is of key interest. We talked a little bit about the command structure already. In that lower area where there's task groups, the person documentation that is there is key to not only your structures and your buildings, but especially for the collection, and is a task that should be assigned possibly beforehand. Retrieval and protection is also a question of prioritization. If you can leave undamaged in the environment or undamaged items in the environment that they're in, moving collections is sometimes more dangerous than leaving them in place. So if you have a stable building and a stable environment and collections are not in any immediate danger, then leaving them there is the best thing. If you don't have that environment but you can locate another building that has that location, then move first your collections that are undamaged to that location, since they probably will need the least amount of time to spend on. Damage assessments before you go into an area. Make a quick walkthrough and see what collections are damaged, possibly in groups like works on paper, paintings, the historic house, furniture, and make a list of salvage priorities. And then a historic building is always very different than any other building environment. You want to treat that as a historic building. There's a standard federal regulations. If you're on the historic register, you don't want to just start changing the environment in your building. So a historic building will definitely be different than a modern museum building, where you possibly could change the climate pretty quickly. So that's some of the first key things even before starting salvaging your collection. The response team, two of the key people in the salvage process are both the salvage coordinator. In a perfect world, the salvage coordinator should both know your facilities, know your collections, know where to look for, and find the collections that are on your priority list, and also be able to locate locations where you could set up a salvage and recovery center. A documentation coordinator is of key importance. Document when you arrive, the situation you find your collection in. Every step of the process in the salvage procedure needs to be documented for your own purposes, for insurance purposes, for future maybe conservation purposes. It's of key importance to know in what condition your artwork was, and every step of the way, either it gets moved, it gets treated, everything needs to be photographed, notes made about those photographs, so you can look back, especially if you have a huge collection damaged, where you can go back to your notes and actually find those and that information that is there. Now, the top 10 problems are actually the first one. 85% of all damage is water. So if you're talking about bursting pipes, water from hurricanes, the flood level, groundwater coming up, 85% of damage is water. So that probably needs to be a key ingredient of everybody's salvage and recovery program. Extreme environmental conditions could be anything from your air conditioning breaking down and having no climate control for a couple of days in your building, to water intrusion. Mold is a huge problem, since especially in Florida, mold can start to form at any time after the temperature goes up after 70 degrees. Mold is a big problem, and extreme care with your collection needs to be placed on that one. Possibly isolate any mold breakouts. Muds could be another one, especially with water, muddy residues on your artifacts, paintings, works on paper. Bleeding dyes with different collections like works on paper. If they get wet, if there's different materials, they could bleed over into other works on paper. Textiles, anything you can think of there would be something that could bleed over into their collections. Corrosions, the same thing. If your climate control is not working, then corrosion can start to form on any metal objects, but also things like staples in works on paper or paper strips that you maybe didn't think about. One of the things at the ringling corrosion was actually the pipes in our sprinkler system. Since there is water in the pipes once in a while, the corrosion's in the pipes, and when the sprinkler system discharges, there's a amount of corrosion that actually can come down to your collection. So, and soot and ash, of course, a fire is probably one of the worst disasters that can happen because it's the most difficult to recover from. And where all the other ones are possibly easier treatable with just clean water, anything that got burned and has soot or ash on it, you don't want to rinse, you don't want to touch or contaminate something else. It needs vacuuming, and probably a conservator that needs to help you with that. Broken objects, that might be happening even moving artworks. Could be a small disaster as transporting an artwork and you have a piece that will fall and break, or during a storm the collection might fall over. Documentation is very important there too. A piece could be shattered in several pieces, so document every piece, label it, and and store it in appropriate ways. Pests, the same thing during storms or fires. Larger animals like rodents, rats, raccoons might actually come into areas that you're not normally seeing. One of the key things in our hurricane plans is to make sure that we empty all garbage cans and containers, hopefully before, if we have that time period before a storm. So if there is any animals or anything looking for food, then hopefully that's not a place where they'll be coming to. Hazardous materials. Your buildings might house things that you might not be always very careful about chemicals. There might be asbestos in your buildings if they're built before 1978. If you have a conservation lab, there might be chemicals that become separate from their containers. So that's something to definitely keep a lookout for. Just a quick glossary of some of the terms that are used a lot in especially water emergencies. Air drying, interleaving, freezing, on-site dehumidification, rinsing, vacuum drying, and vacuum freezing. Probably of all these methods, rinsing is used a lot. Clean water to rinse papers that possibly are contaminated is something that probably is something that will happen often. Air drying, just basically having a work of art that was in water, leaving it dry, putting it off the ground, is something that is a very useful method and successful in most of the times. Interleaving is using a blotting material of some type to take the water from works on paper or books. If you have those materials available, they should be in your supplies. If you have a large collection of works on paper, books that you cannot address in the first 48 hours, freezing is a really great method to kind of put everything on hold until you have time to assess it. It prevents mold from growing, so the availability of a freezer on site might be great, or a rental contract facility with a freezing company can be really, really important. On-site dehumidification by humidifiers and fans is very important. But the same thing, if you have a historic house, you just do not want to drastically change the climate of a historic house, because you have works that will, by drying out, actually damage more than with water in it. So you want a gradual change. So on-site dehumidification can work great for buildings, office facilities, carpets, wainscoting that are modern. But with a historic building, you have to be very careful in changing that climate immediately. Starting with our first set of collections, paintings. And I'm talking mainly about water damage, because that is something that we have that 85% chance of happening, and is also one of the easier things to work with. Fire is usually much more destructive, but the safest way to work with a painting that got water damage is to take it out of its frame, put it up on blocks, put it in a safe place, keep it up horizontally with the painting side up, and make sure nothing is touching the surface of the painting, and avoid direct sunlight. And these are some of the museum practices that are given to us by the Historic Preservation Society. In practical use, at the Ringling a couple of years ago, we had an incident where one of our HVAC systems malfunctioned. The HVAC piping at that time was in between the ceiling and the roof, so all the water literally came down in a deluge in two of our galleries. Both galleries were filled with paintings on panel, paintings on canvas, wood sculptures. It was a historic structure in the room. There was wood elements, wainscoting, historic ceiling, historic columns. One of the things that we did not realize is what happened around Thanksgiving with a minimal staff there. In the middle of the night, we actually got the warning because our sprinkler system smoke alarms went off because of the dust probably that came up because of the water coming down. And our closest staff that knew how to deal with artwork was about 15 to 20 minutes away. That's when they arrived. They found literally the water coming through the ceilings. What was key for us was, because we had such a mix of works, the paintings in those galleries, we needed to know the handling notes almost for them to be safely removed. We had a situation there where you both had the disaster happening. We wanted to start the salvage procedure immediately. This was isolated to 2 galleries. Our other galleries were at that moment a safe location. But we had staff there that, for example, did not know which paintings were cradles. We had some panel paintings in there that had a wood structure behind it that makes it very, very heavy, where you could, even though the painting looked small and you would be able to lift it off the wall, you actually need 4 strong people and maybe a lift to get it down. Some of the paintings had, for example, security screws, a lockable system. What person in your organization does know which paintings are secured to the wall and where are the keys was one of the key moments in our assessment. Some heavy sculptures that were not liftable, some very, very large paintings that were not liftable. So besides somebody looking for the emergency shut-off for the water, we had people assessing that situation, covering in plastic what was necessary, moving everything else what we could move, looking at the vulnerability of the works of art first, looking at the importance to the collection of those works first, looking at, to the monetary value of some of the paintings, and moving that into a safe spot. And then we kind of started the process after the water was shut off, paintings were moved, in taking works that were out there that were soaked out of their frames, putting them up on blocks, letting them dry. Our climate, luckily, was perfect in the rest of the museum, so we could use that area as a safe location. Documentation started because we could not, at the same time, save our paintings and start documenting. So it started at the moment where we had everything removed and the water was shut off. And fortunately, we didn't have too much. Just by air drying the works, we didn't have too much real damage, and we kept assessing those artworks for a year after the water came down. There was not too much damage to the artworks because they were in a stable climate right after. What was interesting, what we didn't expect, was actually the threat of pests didn't start until 6 months later. We had a huge termite outbreak just from the water, which was kind of its own disaster in itself, because at the same time this was a historic gallery where we could not enclose everything and just fumigate it. So we had to treat individual works by anoxic treatment. We had to treat the room with injections. Viking would have damaged some of the color pigments in our large paintings, so we couldn't just fumigate the gallery. So we had actually almost, it's still going on, a 5-year process of recovery and salvage just at that one incident of the HVAC system breaking. So resulting out of that, we established procedures where we are putting handling notes for all our objects once we move them. And we figured out what exactly you need to move them. We put that with the object files in our database, so we have that available for future reference, so we know hopefully what to take off the wall, what's possible. And we actually readdressed the piping system in our HVAC, where now everything is going over the roof instead of in between the ceiling. And we established a better pest control program and a monitoring program, because that was definitely one of the outcomes of our water, was a 5-year plan to control termites after that. And so it was something that we didn't really anticipate either when the water was coming down. We kept looking for flaking paintings until it was April and termite season, and we realized that was a result of our water coming down the ceiling. For photographs, if they're framed, and it is possible, it pretty much would be the same procedure. It's taking them out of the frame once they get wet, and any materials that are not historic to the photograph, matting, the backing, everything that got wet we can get rid of. And if you have a small collection of photographs, they could be air dried on racks or hung with clips to dry on the area that is not the actual photograph, and they could be rinsed with clean, cool water. But at the same time, if you have too many photographs that are got wet, freezing is a great tool to postpone your treatment and focus on one part of the collection at a time. If the photograph, for one reason or another, is attached to your glass or your plexi, leave it alone until you can get a conservator or somebody else in that has expertise in that area to remove it from the frame in the plexi. So that would be a case-by-case basis. Books and paper is very relevant. I think it's, if I just read it correctly, the Spencer Art Museum just had a flood and has to treat 20,000 objects in their collection. Rinsing, the same thing with clean water, and drying them standing up, kind of opened up, is a very good way to recover and salvage your books. If you have too many items, freezing them would be a good option. You can pack books together. Same thing, the works on paper, in a material that will not get it into direct contact with the cold, some kind of boxing materials. If you have a small collection, air drying and sometimes blotting, putting interleaving sheets in between your works of paper might help. If it's a large collection, then definitely go for the freezing method. Electronic media is a whole new thing. We haven't actually really had that experience at the Ringling either. Some of the general museum practices are pretty easy to understand. No scratching. That's something that will work for everything from the CDs to diskettes to videotapes. Clean water, I didn't know that either, but apparently you are able to pull out a video if the encasing is damaged, rinse it, and then put it back in a later date into a structure, and that can save your videos. A basic drying rack can hold a whole bunch of CDs and just wait till things are air dried. That's a good method. But electronic media is definitely something that you want to maybe take a look at with your IT department as well. And if it's a collections item related to an object, then they might have the information in your IT department just from a general use of CDs or audio, anything that has to do with that. I was talking before about customizing your plan to what you have in your collection. Supply-wise, that definitely is also a good rule. There's different supplies that you might think of in an emergency. General supplies like batteries, flashlights, umbrellas, boots I put in here. It's something, talking about a practical case study. At the Ringling, we had a break in our sewer system that actually the water came through in one of our non-climate controlled storage areas where we keep some of our bronze sculptures. And what we realized going in, which we never thought about before, is that we had boots in our emergency supplies, but they were all the size of our security guards, which when they wanted to send in the registrars, they actually didn't fit in the boots, and they wouldn't allow us to walk through the sewer without having some kind of protective. And so there you go when you talk about customizing your supplies, think that way, and sometimes you don't find out what that customization is until you actually have to use the necessity. But things like tape, garbage bags, blotting materials, paper, sometimes newspaper, anything you can think of that would be necessary, anything object handling like gloves, masks, same thing for sewage. In this particular area, we luckily had our accounting paperwork that was we have to keep for a certain amount of years before it can be destroyed. It was also in the sewage bill, so we had to isolate that pretty fast. It was amazing how fast the mold grew on those papers. But just to have gloves and masks to go quickly through that information to salvage what you needed was key in our case. And thinking, for example, what staff could do that, not people with asthma, maybe people are pregnant, or any health conditions that would prevent you from working with objects that are in that situation. They're important to note beforehand. And anything packing materials, labels, boxes, anything that you need to store your collections. And they might be different. We have a large library, large archival institution, but also enormous Rubens paintings that I cannot really go anywhere with or pack up easily. So you have to be prepared to have things available to relocate those items. So for example, for our Rubens paintings, not that we could do it very quickly, but we do have a sonotube available in case we needed to roll up something that size and move it around. Now training, I just talked about, is one of the hardest things because you don't really want to go through the disaster to actually learn what you need to know. There are two great examples. One of our registrars in 2010 attended the workshop at the Atletiki Museum that was led by their conservators, and she was very impressed by having just a small kids pool outside, throw in objects that of course can be thrown out afterwards, but throw in a whole bunch of materials that possibly are in your collection, from old books to prints to maybe a photograph to anything, and then actually work in groups and see how you would go about it to salvage this collection and what you would do. Note the steps and actually monitor your collection for a while. So that is a great idea to implement into a salvage and a recovery plan and a training. We talked before here in our group about fire extinguisher training. One of the things, it's wonderful to have a training with your staff and possibly volunteers on how to use fire extinguishers, because that's a scary thing to have to use, but also to actually know what type of materials are in your fire extinguishers can be very important for the salvage. Some of them are water-based, you have chemical-based. If you don't know what you sprayed up on your materials, you might actually do more damage than good. So actually knowing what kind of fire extinguishers you have and what type of collections might be really important for the recovery. So if you have to tell your conservator, we use this type of agent on our painting or on our work of paper, might actually help save it in the future. So both the training and the use of fire extinguishers and the chemical components are a great way to train some of these issues. Otherwise, it's just probably walking through your collections and think about what possibly could go wrong and what you would need in case something happens. Now, some of the standard information, there's great resources available. One of them is, and I have it right here in front of me for our group, is the Salvage Wheel from the Heritage Preservation, and it gives you the steps both for the processes, and then goes by type of materials and the standard museum and archives practices on how to salvage those materials. And they have this not only in the wheel that you can easily use, but there's also a booklet with a CD with information on it. And just a couple of months ago, they developed an app for that. So if you have an iPhone and you're able to use it, actually you can go by disaster and by the type of material that you're looking at and actually look up what the procedures are for those. The Canadian Conservation Institute is a great resource for anything collection-wise. They have great technical bulletins, and for example, works on paper and mold that you can find online or either in a library. There's a great website and a book by a company named Edwards, and it's basically the yellow pages for all vendors that you possibly could need in case of an emergency. So if you're looking for somebody who's renting freezers or renting generators or basic supplies from tape to archivally folders, paper, this is just an index of all those companies that offer different materials. The last two are just great websites. one by Stanford, one in Philadelphia, that offer information about recovery and salvage. So there's lots of great information out there, and if you can customize it to your own collection, I think you have a great start to a recovery and salvage plan. And that was the end of my presentation.
Thanks so much, Francois. I'm going to take over the Can everyone hear me? Hi, it's Robin. I'm going to take over the Q&A for Francois, so if anyone has any questions for her, go ahead and speak up now. And we actually have two here in South Florida, so why don't you, Emily, why don't you go ahead and ask a quick question.
My first question is, what types of events can result in water damage? I know I'm thinking of their sprinkler, burst pipes, sewer backup you mentioned. Are there others that you can offer?
I think if I heard it correctly, you were asking for other reasons for water damage. There could be lots of other reasons for water damage, hurricanes, flooding, if you're close to the coastline. Our storage is actually under sea level, so that could be a reason. Groundwater coming up, pipe bursting, HVAC systems malfunctioning, sometimes debris from your roofing, your gutter system. If things are not cleaned out, water can just come in through awkward ways. I can't think of anything else. Leaky roof.
And then we have one more question.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about rinsing, specifically paper documents, if there is a best technique that you can recommend.
I was going to say it's probably a great question for our next conservator as well, but as I understand it, clean water is key. So when you talk about supplies, having clean water on hand might be one of the key supplies there too. I think pretty much in paper, unless you have bleeding or the ashes or soot or anything, other materials that you could spread, rinsing with clean water in just a big basin and then have it air dry on either a rack or with clips is one of the best methods to actually preserve and salvage your collection.
Yeah, and I'll add to that this website that Francois placed on her page, the heritagepreservation.org, they have a lot of videos on their website that show exactly how to rinse books, exactly how to do things. So it is if they're YouTube videos, I mean, you could sit there and play them and stop them and look at them as much as you want, and that's really, really useful.